Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. So today we're diving straight into the absolute heavyweights shaping our modern world. When you look at the global economy right now, it's pretty clear it's being pulled by the gravity of three massive giants: the United States, China, and India. These three countries are essentially writing the script for the future of global development. But to really grasp how they're doing this, we need to completely shift our perspective. Now, usually when we talk about these economic superpowers, we tend to start right here. We ask the classic, obvious question, right? Which economy is bigger? We look at nominal GDP, we rank them 1, 2, and 3, and we basically treat it like a scoreboard.
But actually, that's entirely the wrong question. I mean, focusing just on who has the biggest total number completely misses the really fascinating story unfolding just beneath the surface.
The deeper, much more important question we should be asking is this: what kind of economy are they actually building? Because the United States, China, and India, they don't represent the same path of development. They aren't just three large versions of the exact same thing. No, they represent three distinctly different models of capitalism. We're talking about three entirely different ways of organizing growth, organizing production, managing labor, and utilizing state power.
So here's how we're going to break this down. First, the three global giants. Second, the United States in private innovation. Third, China's state-coordinated scale. Fourth, India's demographics and services. And finally, number 5, the true cost of growth.
Okay, let's dive into this. Part 1, the three global giants.
To put things into perspective, let's look at the 2024 numbers from the World Bank, because they paint a really staggering picture. The United States sits at about 340 million people. China comes in at 1.41 billion. And India is now the world's most populous country at 1.45 billion. I mean, the sheer demographic weight here is just immense. These aren't just nations, they are literal continent-sized engines of human activity. But as you'll see, how they actually harness that activity is radically different.
Which brings us to part 2, the United States, private innovation.
Looking at the OECD's March 2026 interim outlook, they project US GDP growth of 2.0% in 2026 and 1.7% in 2027. So, what's actually driving this? In a word, tech. Specifically strong AI-related investment. And this perfectly highlights the US model. It's built entirely around private capital, finance, technology, and consumer markets. It's a system where private firms and huge corporations largely dominate economic life, and they drive some pretty incredible innovation.
But of course, that brings us to the inherent trade-offs of the American model. On one hand, you have this immense power, right? Dynamic innovation, massive reserves of private capital, and these high-value corporate sectors. But that growth sits right alongside deep inequality, major housing stress, sky-high healthcare costs, and debt. It's a highly dynamic economy for sure, but one that can be socially uneven, leaving a lot of everyday citizens pretty exposed to market risks. The main takeaway here is that in the US, private innovation leads the charge. But the safety net? Well, it can be pretty thin.
Let's pivot to part 3, China, state-coordinated scale.
Now, looking at the OECD projections for China, we see a different story. Growth is easing a bit to 4.4% in 2026 and 4.3% in 2027. This growth is being propped up by strong export performance and government subsidies, but it's simultaneously being weighed down by continued weakness in residential investment. You see, unlike the US, China combines its market forces with much stronger state coordination. The government is deeply involved in long-term planning. They steer development and they direct finance right into strategic sectors. And right now, China is actually navigating a massive structural shift. For decades, they built their entire model on state-directed manufacturing and massive infrastructure projects, delivering just unparalleled industrial capacity. But today, they're facing some serious headwinds. We're talking property sector strain, demographic pressures, and a slower growth rate than we've seen in past decades. In fact, Reuters reported in April 2026 that China is actively pushing to expand its services sector to help balance this out. Basically, they're trying to pivot from investment-heavy growth toward a more balanced domestic demand. And let me tell you, that is an incredibly complex maneuver to pull off.
Moving on to part 4, India, demographics and services.
So a Reuters economist poll from April 2026 projects India's growth for the current fiscal year at a very robust 6.7%. And what's absolutely fascinating here is that India isn't just copying China's manufacturing-heavy blueprint. They aren't copying America's finance-first approach either. Instead, India's growth is being driven remarkably by services, by technology, and by rapidly expanding domestic demand.
But we really have to look at the full picture here. Yes, India boasts a massive demographic scale, a booming digital infrastructure, and immense long-term growth potential. Yet, the sheer unevenness of this growth is really striking. Reuters notes that India's informal sector still accounts for nearly half of its entire GDP. Think about that for a second. Almost half of the economy operates completely outside the formal story of headline expansion. So while the potential is staggering, issues like regional disparity and unequal access to stable work remain massive hurdles.
All right, let's bring it all together in part 5, the true cost of growth.
Let's zoom out and look at how all this builds into 3 core philosophical questions about how we actually organize human societies. The United States is essentially asking the world, what happens when private capital and innovation dominate? China's asking, what happens when the state heavily guides markets and industry? And India's asking, what happens when a huge post-colonial society grows rapidly but unevenly through demographic scale and services? These aren't just questions about money, they are foundational questions about the very design of a society.
And it's vital to remember that these 3 models, they aren't operating in a vacuum. According to the IMF's April 2026 World Economic Outlook, our global context right now is highly fragile. The IMF is warning of renewed pressures from war, geopolitical fragmentation, and persistent inflation risks. They're projecting overall global growth at just 3.1% in 2026 and 3.2% in 2027. So the US, China, and India are all competing and trying to adapt their models inside a world that is actively dealing with energy shocks and deep instability.
Because when we strip away the GDP percentages and the trade balances, we're left with this simple reality. An economy is never just a number. It is a way of organizing life. It determines what kinds of work are actually available to you, how inequality is managed in your city, and whether national development actually produces tangible, everyday security for ordinary people.
Ultimately, there's no single winner here. Capitalism doesn't just come in one form. It can be market-led, state-directed, or driven by massive demographic potential. But whichever model a society chooses, the fundamental question remains exactly the same. I want you to look closely at your own society, look way past the headline numbers, and ask yourself, who actually benefits from growth? Who carries the cost? And what kind of society does that economic model truly produce? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I highly encourage you to keep asking these vital questions.